Anyone in their lifetime is going to have a parasitic infection, whether they know it or not. I had 5 different patients submit stool samples to 5 different labs in New York City, and we got 5 different results on every patient. There was no labs agreed. You'd be shocked at how many people don't have it, but yet they've been treating themselves for all this time for this condition they don't have. There's no such thing as a pharmaceutical deficiency. It's not how your body works. Your body doesn't depend on drugs. Drugs basically cover up or suppress symptoms.
Welcome. Glad to have you here. So, Doctor, did I pronounce that correctly? Is it Biamonte?
That's correct.
Okay. So we have Dr. Biamonte today. You've got sort of an interesting profession, I suppose, interesting sort of take on some of the medical stuff. So maybe if you would take a moment just to share a little bit about what you do exactly, and then we can get into some questions on that.
Sure. I'm a naturopath and a certified clinical nutritionist licensed in New York State. And I specialize in handling candidiasis in people. Also any infectious disease like parasites or Epstein-Barr virus or Lyme disease, things of this nature. I use exclusively botanicals and nutraceuticals in treatment, which makes for effective treatment without a lot of side effects and drug problems.
Okay. And so candidiasis, I assume some people know what that is, but overgrowth of Candida typically affects various parts of the body. How do you, it's interesting. A lot of people are interested in parasites these days, and I guess because Candida might be considered a parasite, and depending on how you define it. But
every 5 to 10 years in the natural health field, there's a new fad.
Yeah.
Going back in the 80s, it was vitamin E, then it became fish oils, then it was vitamin D, then it was CoQ10. So there's always something new. And I think the interest in parasites now goes back to Hulda Clark, who wrote some books in the 90s about how parasites were the underlying reason for cancer and HIV, and people laughed at her and said she was crazy. And now all the medical studies are coming out saying that she was totally spot on. She would also be crazy about RFK Jr. right now, because he's also pointing out how a lot of the chemical additives and whatnot in our foods also cause illness. And in her books, she explained how parasites started the biochemical process of some kind of abnormality going on in your DNA and then in your cells. And when you throw on top of that the different chemical additives in our food, it just explodes. So my opinion on this is that it's the research is catching up to what we've known empirically.
What percentage of human beings in this country and throughout the world, when I was deployed to Afghanistan as a trauma surgeon, I remember treating all these Afghan locals with, various, antihelminthics and all the different, various anti-parasitical and worm medications. And they were full of worms. I mean, they were just full of worms. You'd operate on their gut and you'd be pulling all these worms out of them. But what percentage of the population do you think is infested or infected with various parasites?
I would say to be very conservative, 35% at any given time. And I have colleagues who will tell me that I'm nuts, and it's probably 90%. But I think to be conservative about it, it's probably at any given time 35%. And I would also say that anyone in their lifetime is going to have a parasitic infection, whether they know it or not. And they're going to be part of that 35%.
Now, this is when you're talking about parasites, you're talking about outside of normal, just
overgrowth. When I talk about any infection, whether it's parasitic, it's yeast, bacterial, Lyme disease, we're only speaking of overgrowth, because that's a trap you'll get in with medical doctors, where they'll say everybody has Candida. Well, it's true, everyone has Candida, but not everyone has an overgrowth of Candida. And when you have an overgrowth of Candida, it releases a huge amount of mycotoxins and alcohols and whatnot that cause pathology. So we're only talking about overgrowth.
And what distinguishes those that have overgrowth versus those that don't? Is it because there's this sort of terrain versus germ theory, and some people say if you've got a compromised host, they're going to be more susceptible to this versus the relative how strong the infecting agent is, because some Shigella, Salmonella might be more devastating to people, even if they're healthy. So how do we determine who gets it, who doesn't?
Well, the first thing you look at when you're discussing this is to look at the biome, the microbiome in your gut, and you want to see whether or not you have enough commensal and normal flora to offset the pathogen. Because many people are walking around with Citrobacter frundi, Klebsiella pneumoniae, um, all types of strains of Staph and MRSA, and they're not necessarily um, symptomatic of these things. And the reason they're not symptomatic is because their commensal flora is strong enough, and there are other factors in their intestinal tract, like for instance, their fecal IgA and fecal IgE are high enough to essentially crowd around these organisms and stop them from causing pathology. But on the other hand, there are laboratories who have, by looking at the population and by looking at symptoms people can have, they've developed reference ranges for these organisms. So they can tell us that if you have X amount of that organism in a sample, the odds are is you're going to have pathology or you're going to have symptoms from that organism. So those are two viewpoints. One is just sheerly looking at the quantity of the microbe you might have, but another is looking at whether or not your biome is strong enough to withstand that microbe and not allow it to become pathological.
Obviously, these very, we know our gut microbiome is changing on a daily basis. I mean, it's I think certain colonies grow and shrink, sort of. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but my understanding is they can change quite dynamically. And so, how do we sort between normal fluctuations versus this is an over? Is it just a severe, massive amount? Is it like a 10x, 100x fold or
Yeah,
something like that? Where you look at something like that?
yes, you can look at it that way. And with the new wave of stool tests that we have a new generation of stool testing, which uses DNA technology to measure the DNA of the microorganism, which gives you a better idea as to whether or not you truly have an excess amount, as opposed to a microscopy study or just a stool culture, which can often miss things. Stool is interesting. I wrote a manual on this, which is going to appear in my next book on Candida, because stool samples are not homogeneous at all. And because they're not, you very often don't pick up pathogens on the first sample. I did a study in my practice 20 years ago where I had 5 different patients submit stool samples to 5 different labs in New York City, which is where I was practicing. And we got 5 different results on every patient. There was no labs agreed, and it's because of a few factors. It's the testing techniques could vary lab to lab, and the stool sample, most importantly, is going to vary lab to lab. You probably have heard of Genova Labs. Well, Genova Labs used to be called Great Smokies Labs, and back in those days, Marty Lee and Steve Barry were in charge, and I was friendly with them. And they allowed a group of my patients to submit stool samples every day for 30 days as an experiment to see how the biome would vary in the stool. And we had some pretty interesting variations day to day, especially with pathogens. Not so much with the commensal flora. That was usually pretty stable. What you were referring before about the flora changing, well, it's live. It's literally a live environment, and it does change, but it doesn't change in a massive way where you would then become deficient in certain flora or have excess of certain natural normal flora. What happens is the flora changes into different strains, they evolve. So when you hear, as an example of a company saying that their probiotic has 20 million strains, and this other company is saying, well, mine has 25 million, and they're arguing about different strains. And all these strains that you hear about, is even specialized strains that they talk about, they all eventually evolve from your basic strains. You have Lactobacillus acidophilus in your small intestine, and you have bifidobacteria in your colon. And from those two basic strains, a lot of these other specialized flora products that you hear about eventually evolve. So to to go crazy buying every acidophilus product because this one has a strain that this other one doesn't have is ridiculous, because they're all eventually going to evolve in your own intestinal tract and be there. So that's more of what the evolution is in the gut. But when you're looking at a stool samples vary. It's not a liquid like blood or like urine. It's a clunky, chunky medium, and it's not always going to be representative of what's really going on in your intestinal tract just by getting one sample. If you take one sample every day for, like, as I said, 30 days, you'll see tremendous variations in pathogens that will show up and then won't show up. So the golden rule with a stool sample is you get false negatives, you don't get false positives. If you get something showing up, you know it's there. If it doesn't show up, you're wondering if it's there and it just didn't show up.
Yeah, I saw a study a few years back looking at probiotic. I think it was probiotic efficacy, and they were saying that because they were looking at stool samples, and they were saying that the stool sample did not match the actual intestinal, I guess, actual intestinal study. Maybe they did an intestinal biopsy or something like that,
Mhm.
and it kind of supports it that you may miss a lot of things on that. Now, you said you focus in primarily on Candida. Is that just because of its how common it is, or what, or does it just affect more people and more? What are the what are the consequences of having candidal overgrowth outside of thrush and yeast infections and stuff like that? What kind of things might we see?
I started to concentrate on Candida because I started to see what a mystery it was for a lot of doctors and a lot of patients, and how inconsistent the treatments were. So it got me very curious as to how this thing keeps fooling everybody, and how this organism just keeps coming back in people despite all of these medical treatments. That's what got me interested in Candida. And I wanted to solve the riddle, which I did. And that's all discussed in my book, The Candida Chronicles, which you can get on Amazon. And Candida can produce a host of symptoms in people. It can produce symptoms you would never believe. You mentioned the base symptoms here, like thrush, vaginal yeast infections, but Candida can cause different types of cancer. It can cause different types of arthritis. It can cause chronic fatigue syndrome. It can cause chemical, or what we used to call years ago, a universal reactor, somebody who's just so grossly chemically intolerant that they have to stay in their house. They can't go to a supermarket or a bar, or some place where people wear perfume or there's cigarette smoke or chemical odors, because they just can't tolerate it. It would practically cripple them. And Candida causes a host of nutritional deficiencies because it is a parasite, technically. In Latin, the definition of a parasite is one who eats off the table of another. And that's a typical definition that we use for worms and protozoa. But Candida does the same thing. Candida steals your nutrients. It takes vitamin D, it takes iron, it takes B12 from your system, and you become deficient in those things. As an example of this, the mechanism of action of a few of the most popular pharmaceutical prescription antifungals is to block the candida's ability to absorb iron, or block the candida's ability to absorb vitamin D. So this is showing you right there that these nutrients being blocked lead to the demise of the candida. And then, from a flip side of looking at it, if you have candida, would you want to take large amounts of supplementary iron or vitamin D to feed it and make it worse?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because a lot of people say, "What does Candida eat?" And like some people, like I am a proponent of meat based diets, and we see a lot of improvements in gut health in general. Some people postulate that maybe you're not feeding some of these organisms. Maybe there's other mechanisms by which it works. What specifically does Candida eat? Hey, folks, it's Dr. ShawnBaker here. Hey, if you or someone you love is suffering from chronic disease and you're tired of just managing symptoms with potions, pills, and procedures, I want you to check out Revero.com. Our team of dedicated professionals is committed to tackling the root cause of your issue and finally getting you healthy. Hurry up, though. Our spaces are filling up very quickly.
Sugar.
Okay. All right.
Sugar and starch. And what it does, what happens is that B complex vitamins in your gut convert or break down the starch into sugar, which Candida then eats. So this is another reason why somebody with Candida could react badly to B complex vitamins.
Okay.
A
Fair enough.
carnivore diet is essential to get rid of Candida, because the carnivore diet doesn't feed it. Candida hasn't evolved to the point where it necessarily feeds on fats or meat or protein. It has evolved to the point where it's actually consuming alcohol, sugars, and different kind of artificial sweeteners or sweeteners that we can consider a bit avant-garde, like stevia and things. That's happened in the last 30 years because so many people with candida are now eating those foods because they can't handle like normal natural sweet ingredients from their diet. So candida's evolved and genetically mutated where it now can eat those things, but it can't eat protein and it can't eat fat. So that starves it. And when you go on the every candida diet, well, I'm not going to say every because there's a few people out there who have some strange ideas about candida diets, but the majority of candida diets by professionals who've studied this material, and they can get some sort of result, is a low sugar, low starch diet because you need to starve the candida while you're killing it with whatever your medicine is going to be, whether it's pharmaceutical or botanicals. So it's starve and attack.
Okay, and let me just one of the, because you mentioned HIV, one of the clinical factors a lot of people with HIV, human immunodeficiency virus syndrome or whatever, would develop thrush, and they would have these candidal overgrowths, and a
Mm.
lot of we see it in a lot of people post antibiotic, people with immunocompromised systems. So obviously the immune system has to play a role in surveillance and getting rid of the candida. Is that a fair statement as well?
Yes, people who are at end stage cancer, people with HIV, eventually develop candida, or any kind of immunosuppression can eventually develop candida because your immune system controls candida. It's the immune system primarily in your gut which controls candida, and it's also the beneficial flora in your gut which keeps it under control. So once those two factors are out of balance, then the candida just overgrows. It's like looking at a food chain. Candida is part of the food chain in your gut biome. And when lactobacillus and bifidus bacteria are compromised, then they're not there to keep the candida under control. So the candida just freely overgrows.
Okay, and so if somebody comes in reporting just vague symptoms, there could be, as you probably know, there's a whole bunch. I'm tired, I'm fatigued, I've got
Hmm.
gut pain or whatever it might be, and you say, well, I think it could potentially be some sort of parasite. I assume you get stool samples and you figure out which ones are present, which ones aren't. How do we target it? I
Hmm.
mean, I imagine sometimes people are co-infected with multiple organisms, and so you have to
Most of
work
the
your way
time.
through that. Yeah,
Yep.
and so you mentioned carnivore diet for candida, so you want to starve it, and then you, at the beginning of this conversation, you said there are a number of nutraceuticals, herbs, and whatnot that can be utilized. So what does that look like for you? What does a typical treatment look like for you, and how long might it take?
Um, I've been doing this for close to 40 years. And for the first half of that, I did it wrong. I listened to the vitamin company salesman. I listened to some other doctors who wrote very popular books. And I kept having patients tell me that they felt better for a while and then all the symptoms came back. So I set out to find out why that was. So the first thing I discovered was Candida is very mutatable. It mutates very easily. It genetically switches. So when you're treating it with botanicals or medicines, you must rotate the medicines because after 21 days, Candida will mutate and it will become drug resistant to whatever it's been attacked with. So if you take nystatin for 21 days, after about 21 days, the Candida cells start to mutate and the nystatin becomes less effective. So in my book, I lay out 5 different phases of treating Candida. The first phase we call phase 0 is essentially a bowel cleanse that removes the surface layers of yeast, bacteria, and parasites. It attempts to handle the bulk of what's on the surface. Then when we do the testing that we do, which is usually stool and organic acids for different microbes, we then look and see what exact microbes are left, because those are the ones that are going to be the stubborn ones. And we target them with precise botanicals, which are known to be able to kill those microbes. And we have the person rotate those microbes every 4 days. When they complete that phase, we've eliminated probably 70% of the bad microbes. And we go to the second phase where we use um, nutraceuticals that are very specific to killing these organisms in the very deep recesses of your gut, because that's essentially where they hide, and that's where they block the probiotics from being able to return. Probiotics and different pathogens actually repel each other. But the trick is to get the pathogens low enough to where the probiotics will again stick to your gut lining. And if you're not getting those pathogens low enough to where the probiotics can reinoculate and stick to the gut lining, the probiotics just end up going in the toilet. So you've got to lower that amount of whether it's bacteria, parasite, or candida, whatever the pathogen is in the gut. You have to lower it to the point where the probiotics can take over. And that's going to be in my second phase of treating this. And the other thing, too, that people don't really appreciate is that once you've had candida, candida affects the collagen in your gut to the point where it makes it harder for the probiotic to reestablish and stick to the gut lining. So sometimes the probiotics aren't the most important thing. What's more important are prebiotics, the things that are going to change that environment to help the probiotic grow and also help to strengthen the collagen so the probiotic has something to stick to where it's going to be stable. So those are my first phases of eliminating these organisms, and a lot of it is based on testing, so that we're not treating the person for something they don't have. One of the most common things we see on that is leaky gut. I get patients all the time come into my office and they sit in front of me and they go, well, you're looking at the worst case of leaky gut you've ever seen in your career. I have this symptom, I have that symptom, I have this symptom. I've been treating this leaky gut for 10 years and it won't get better. And I'll always ask, the key question is, have you tested for leaky gut? Because you don't know if you have some other problem that's giving you similar symptoms. I don't have to test for leaky gut. I know I have it, blah, 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 blah. And I'll get them to humor me and test for it. And you'd be shocked at how many people don't have it, but yet they've been treating themselves for all this time for this condition they don't have. So we've got to use testing to make sure we know what you have. Because if we treat you for the wrong thing, we're wasting time and money. But if we treat you for the correct thing, we can be precise about it.
Yeah, I mean, and just with regard to testing for leaky gut, I know there's like double sugar tests. There's PEG 400, polyethylene glycol tests. There's different things out there. I don't know how commonly they're tested for. I've really seen people actually tested for it. Maybe in your circles and in your practice, you do that on a more regular basis.
We do, and there are two different tests you can do that are the most accurate for leaky gut. One is a zonulin protein test,
Okay,
and
yeah.
the other is a breath test. There's actually a breath test that looks at gases your intestinal tract will create if you have leaky gut, and I found those to be the two most accurate. The mannitol lactulose test, which you just mentioned, is
Mhm.
not as accurate. It has too many false negatives.
Yeah, and it seems like the zonulin one would be quite, because that's what's happening. You're breaking down those little tight junctions, and zonulin
Mhm.
is expressed in there, and so um, how is does leaky gut occur in conjunction with some of this parasitic overgrowth? Is that a typical feature of that, or are they completely separate issues?
No, you could assume that somebody who has leaky gut has some kind of dysbiosis, meaning an overgrowth of pathogens, and that's probably what's caused it. It's rare to find somebody who has leaky gut who doesn't have some kind of overgrowth of pathogens, but it can happen. It can happen due to chemical toxicity, to alcoholism. There are a lot of illnesses or toxic exposure you can get that would cause leaky gut, but coincidentally, they usually cause an overgrowth of these pathogens at the same time. So I would say that it's more than likely you're going to have some kind of dysbiosis if you have leaky gut, but it's possible that you may not. It is possible.
We all live in an environment where, like, I'm breathing in thousands and probably millions of viruses right now and bacteria in the air. So you can't get away from these things. I mean, they're everywhere. But not everybody has this. And so, I mean, are there things you can do to prevent yourself from acquiring these overgrowths? I mean, you're going to be exposed to the
hmm
infectious agents one way or the other, I think. But are there things you can do to sort of immune yourself to these types of things?
Well, aside from taking up a lifestyle like Howard Hughes did, the best thing you could do is watch and protect your biome. Eat a diet that's healthy for your biome, that has enough fiber and enough naturally occurring probiotics from fermented foods that help keep your biome strong. You know, take whatever supplements you find out you need by testing. Eat organic, eat non-GMO. That's a huge, huge point in this, because I have patients who will go to Italy and they go to Italy and eat the same foods that they eat in the United States, and they just have no symptoms at all. And then once they come back here and they try to eat that same food, they're riddled with all their symptoms again. And it's due to the fact that in Italy and countries like that, there is no GMO food. Everything is naturally organic there. So these are some of the things you can do to help yourself so that you don't end up in this pot. And then also stay away from pharmaceuticals. There isn't anybody in the world who's taking any Ozempic or any drug who has an Ozempic deficiency. There's no such thing as a pharmaceutical deficiency. It's not how your body works. Your body doesn't depend on drugs. Drugs basically cover up or suppress symptoms, but they're not nutrition. So the more somebody stays away from drugs, especially broad spectrum antibiotics being used carelessly, they can navigate away from these conditions.
Okay, and you mentioned fermented foods, fiber. I mean, some people will say that fermentation occurring in the gut is problematic, and for some people, it leads to bloating, gas, pain, discomfort. I've seen people with that. That's why I see a lot of people go toward the carnivore diet, and they seem to get relief with that. Is it preferable to eat fermented vegetables because they've already been fermented and it goes around that process, or what's the thought on that?
Fermented vegetables actually, the fermentation is being caused by healthy flora, healthy bacteria. And when you consume those, you're essentially adding to your friendly bacteria. But the reason, I think one of the major reasons why the carnivore diet helps people with these conditions is because they're not getting the starches and the sugar which feed these pathogens. The and from my experience, and I'm a blood type O, I have found that type O's do much better on a higher meat or carnivore diet than type A's. Because when you look at the blood type history of a type A, they basically come from a line of people who are farmers, and their bodies are used to eating a high amount of carbohydrates, higher than a type O would be. So that could be another consideration. But uh, definitely the carnivore diet is going to help somebody with this condition because they're not going to get those sugars and starches that feed those microbes.
Yeah, and so there's I don't know if you how much you pay attention to these social media. There currently is a diet that's becoming popularized called a sugar diet, where the diet basically consists of high amounts of sugar. 500-600 grams a day for some people,
Hmm.
and some people are losing weight and saying they have lots of energy. Do you have any concerns around that particular style of diet?
I think it's the most insane thing I've heard. And I can rationalize and understand the physiology of why it might work, but show me where in human history that's occurred for any period of time. Show me an animal that eats that way in the wild.
Yeah, I mean those are both fair comments. I mean, I don't think evolving humans had access to hundreds of grams of refined sugar every day. I mean, that just wasn't a complete impossibility. And you're right, no animal that I know of eats that. Maybe a hummingbird. I don't know. Maybe drinking nectar or something like that, perhaps. But I can't imagine there's any um, good you know good historical basis for something like this. Although I think people are just starving to death on this. What's happening? They're just
I,
becoming
I agree. Well,
protein deficient.
if you look at the mechanism of how your metabolism works, in order to process that much sugar, you're going to be using up a large amount of B vitamins, zinc, manganese, chromium, vanadium, a whole host of nutrients, and you'll eventually become nutrient deficient from consuming that type of diet because you're not getting those trace elements and those trace nutrients that are involved in metabolizing those foods. That's one of the great things about eating whole foods as opposed to packaged or refined foods is that the whole food comes with the minerals and the vitamins that your body needs to metabolize it. Very often when you eat packaged foods and things of that nature that are refined, you don't get those nutrients. So your body has to draw from its own reserves to metabolize that food stuff because it's not present in the food.
When you mention various herbs and nutraceuticals, which ones do you find to be effective for those? And because my thought is, well, I don't know how much it would occur in a natural diet. Like I said, if I were just eating what's available to me, I probably might not have access to something that only grows in Central America or something like that. So what
Hmm.
what are we talking about when you mean these various nutraceuticals?
This was one of the major discoveries that I made that I talk about in my book. Is it's not the same for everyone. And in order to deter, because your strain or your species of bacteria or candida or whatever is unique, they're not, even though they may all be Candida albicans or Candida tropicalis or Candida glabrata or whatever species it is, it's still unique to itself in terms of what type of medicine or herb will inhibit its growth. And the only way to determine that is through testing. And when you test and you find out what are the correct, um, let's say, the correct antagonists to take for your particular bacteria or strain or whatever, then you can actually get results and be specific. If you just do it on a general basis, you're rolling the dice and you don't know whether or not that nutraceutical, which could be very expensive, is going to work for you or not. So what I do is when I test the person, I will find 4 to 6 that they're sensitive to, hopefully, and then we'll rotate those. We'll take 4 out of the 6 and we'll switch them around every 4 days. So they'll start on the first botanical for 4 days, stop it, then go to the second one, do that for 4 days, stop it, go to the next one, and just keep switching them around until the tests indicate that I've reduced those organisms as much as I can, and then we move them to the next phase, as I described earlier.
Now, one thing, you mentioned, just like, if you stick a medication on, it's like same thing with cancer, they'll zap someone with chemotherapy, they'll kill 98% of the cells, and that 2% that's resistant will then grow back, and now it's resistant to that drug. And we see that with, as you mentioned, when these things turn over every 10 seconds or whatever their half-life is, or reproduction time, they're going to be able to mutate quite dramatically over a short period of time. When you see, like, typically, like Candida, like, I think of things like, thrush or vaginal yeast infections, are usually, they're usually treated with a medication, that kills it a little bit. Maybe, I don't know if it completely kills it. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. What are your thoughts on using those medications, those topical antifungals or oral antifungals, for cases like, chronic nail infections and things like that, which can be damaging to the liver, um, in lieu of using something else?
I never recommend anyone to use any oral prescription antifungal for longer than about a week or 10 days because of the risk factor to your liver and kidneys. And also, if they stay on it for 21 days, they'll develop a mutation and a resistance to not only to that drug, but to other things. When um, Quite a while ago, when I had this one particular office in Manhattan, we had a lab in the office and we were able to do stool cultures on people using this very sensitive culture that we got from France. And it was interesting that all the patients who came to us who had a long story where they'd been bouncing from one doctor to the next trying to fight the candida, none of them had candida albicans. Every single one of them had Candida glabrata, Candida papillaris, or Candida tropicalis. They all had mutated strains because they were being treated incorrectly. It was only the patients who didn't know what Candida was when we checked their stool actually had Candida albicans because no one was treating them for the Candida. They didn't know they had an overgrowth. So their Candida strain didn't go through a mutation.
Interesting. So, you mentioned dietary changes, nutraceuticals, obviously the various testing, organic acids, stool testing to see what you're treating, which certainly makes sense. What other things are often part of the treatment algorithm?
Colonics. Colonics can be essential and can make or break it if the person is constipated. Because if a person is chronically constipated, the pH of their intestinal tract won't shift. Um, when you're constipated, the pH of your intestines becomes overly alkaline. It usually will flip above 7.4, and that's the environment that Candida loves. Candida hates acid. This is why Lactobacillus acidophilus is the thing that protects you from Candida. Acidophilus releases hydrogen peroxides and different natural acids which lower the pH of your intestinal tract into the range where Candida can't really survive well. So, using colonics to help someone with chronic constipation can be essential. Also, if the person is really constipated for a long period of time, they'll develop a lot of mucus and biofilm that the Candida will hide in, and you've got to get rid of that stuff. You have to mechanically flush that out, otherwise, they're never going to get well.
Which of these factors? I mean, you mentioned the colonics. Is anyone that has a candidal overgrowth anywhere in their body, is it also going to be in the colon? Is it almost always going to be there as well?
It's always the nest. The nest is the colon and the small intestine. Arguably the colon first, and then it can move to the small intestine. Then when it moves to the small intestine, it can get into your bile ducts, and it can then travel into your gallbladder and your liver from the colon, which your lymph system drains directly into your colon. So from your colon, it can get into your lymph system and then go anywhere.
All right. So outside of Canada, like other people would be probably more disturbed to find out they've got some sort of worm in them, whether it's a, tapeworm or, cysticercosis or something like that, infecting their muscles and stuff like that. How often do you see those things? And do you treat those very often as well?
Yeah, we see them in about 20% of the people, and it's really interesting there's some television shows on, I think it's on the Discovery Channel or the Learning Channel. There's a show that's called The Monsters Within, and they go through these histories of people, medical histories of people who had crazy symptoms and debilitating, almost fatal diseases, and no one knew what it was until some doctor figured out it was a parasite of some kind. And like for instance, we have a patient who has chronic inflamed colon, chronic diarrhea, and it's from going fishing. And he was in a river in one part of I think it was Montana, that was particularly tended to be high in this one parasite and bacteria, and he acquired those, and no one had figured out his health problem, what was wrong with him in all these like 15 years. He's suffering with this, and then finally a stool test that we did showed these organisms, and when I looked up these organisms online, it there you go, they tend to originate in this place where he had been fishing. So they're when you find them, it's great, but it's sometimes hard to find them because, as we said earlier, they don't always show up in just one stool sample. Sometimes you have to do stool tests with multiple samples to find them, and sometimes you need to repeat it multiple times. But you can find them eventually, and when you do and you isolate them, that's a great thing for the patient.
When you typically see people with these various parasitic, worm infections, I mean, is there typically, like I know you get like hookworm through walking barefoot through certain areas. You can get,
Hmm.
obviously eating certain food. How are they typically, um, what's the history typically look like for that?
For the first symptoms they usually feel are fatigue, headaches, and cognitive problems, and then it can move to digestive problems because the parasites go through an evolution. They start out as an egg or larva, and in their immature forms they can travel through your lymph system, and they can cause the first group of symptoms. They stress out your immune system, so you get fatigued, you can get inflammation, so you get headaches. But when they start to grow and mature, they nestle in your intestinal tract, where they start causing digestive problems. You can get bloody stools, you can get diarrhea, you can get constipation, you can have bloating and gas. And usually, if we just look at the term dysbiosis, which we throw around a lot, technically dysbiosis means you have an imbalance between all the friendly flora and any bad flora, any collection of bad flora. So someone with dysbiosis can have parasites and yeast at the same time, and also harmful bacteria at the same time, because the same bad or weak environment in your gut that would host one would tend to host others. So you can have a conglomerate of harmful organisms there that all need to be eliminated or sterilized. And when you do the stool test and you find out what they have, you then can selectively target these things, and the person is unfortunately going to go through something we call the Herxheimer reaction. Herxheimer reaction we call it a die-off. It was discovered by Dr. Herxheimer, who named it after himself. And basically, what he figured out is that when he treated people for Lyme disease and parasites, the person would feel sick as those organisms were dying because of the toxins they would release. So that's person has to really understand that, and know what to do about it, which is basically drink lots of water to flush it out of your system. But that's what it looks like, to answer your question initially, for them.
And do you find that My guess is just people that are generally immunocompromised, people with other comorbidities, perhaps diabetics, perhaps the elderly, are going to be more susceptible to this thing because I assume their immune system is somewhat compromised. Is that a fair statement?
Diabetics definitely because of the high sugar level in their body. It's chronically feeding a lot of these organisms for sure. And as a person gets older, with the real mechanism, which is kind of funny. I always tell my patients that as you get older, God plays tricks on you. And the major trick he plays is he lowers your stomach acid and he lowers your DHEA levels. So those are the two key things that when you get older can result in a lot of your trouble. Low stomach acid, so you can't digest your food correctly and absorb calcium and minerals. But not only that, when your stomach acid lessens, the pH of your intestines changes again. So it's not unusual to find somebody who has a overly alkaline intestinal pH, which is favorable to all these bad guys because he doesn't have enough stomach acid. And then as your DHEA levels drop as you get older, primarily your testosterone starts to drop because your body converts DHEA into testosterone and all the other hormones. So those are two key things as you get older that are problematic. Low stomach acid, low DHEA.
Interesting. And I wonder if the low stomach acid is just a pure product of age, or if it's a product of maybe disease that hasn't been managed.
Yeah, it's a good point. I would say from my observation, it seems to be. Um, I can really speak mostly for patients in the U.S. and America as they go through stress, more and more stress. Their adrenal glands start to get weaker, and the adrenals do stimulate stomach acid production. Your vagus nerve can start to come offline, and the vagus nerve is the nerve that directly goes to your stomach to stimulate acid production via potassium. So I would have to go with aging, but aging and having stress as you go along the line.
Yeah, not everybody ages at the same rate. It's pretty clear to me anyway. So,
Yeah, there are genetic factors. Great thing to look at.
okay. Well, I'll tell you what, where can people go to find out more? You said you have a book coming out. Tell us about your practice, maybe any social media you might have so people can find out more about this fairly, pretty interesting topic.
Sure, anybody can go on Amazon and they can buy my book. The book is called The Candida Chronicles by Michael Biamonte, CCNND. They can also find me on social media by doing a search for the Biamonte Center. You can visit my 3 websites. I have one website. My main website is health-truth.com. And my secondary websites are the New York City Candida Doctor and the New York City Thyroid Doctor. Now, people are always asking me, why do you have this website all about thyroid? Well, the reason is because Candida and thyroid are very related. And Candida causes lots of thyroid problems. And there are a lot of things that doctors who are allegedly endocrinologists and experts don't understand about the thyroid. One of the things that they have no education on at all are the trace minerals that act as receptors for thyroid hormone. And this is one of the things I specialize in. I've been doing this for like 30, 35 years, is we analyze the person's hair and we look at their ratios of calcium to potassium and zinc to copper. And those are the minerals that govern how sensitive your tissues are to thyroid hormones. So very often you hear stories about people taking all kinds of thyroid medication, but they still feel not correct. They feel better on the medication, but they don't feel normal, totally normal. And that's because they have problems with these receptor sites. But there are other things that can block their thyroid receptors too. Excessive estrogen, being estrogen dominant, having high cortisol levels. Those can also downregulate your thyroid hormone. Notice I'm not talking about thyroid gland. I'm talking about thyroid hormone. We're strictly looking at the hormone metabolism of your thyroid hormones as they enter the electron transport chain and as they operate in your cells. And they're dependent on that balance of these trace minerals to properly work. So if somebody has elevated copper or elevated calcium, their thyroid hormone is downregulated. And no matter how much medicine they take, they're never going to feel correct. But when you balance those mineral ratios, the person starts to get the full benefit of taking the thyroid hormone medication if that's what they're doing.
Interesting stuff. Well, Dr. Biamonte, thank you for doing this. I appreciate your time. Hopefully this will help some people out, and hopefully some people will seek you out for your expertise if they're suffering from these things. Appreciate your morning, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, sir. Very good. I enjoyed being here with you.